What if I told you that before your first breath, your soul already knew his song? That, somewhere beneath the dust of time, a shepherd's heartbeat still echoes through eternity, the rhythm of a boy who faced giants, wept over his sins, and learned to speak the language of God. Have you ever wondered why heaven chose him, a man of war, a man of desire, a man who failed and rose again? What hidden fire made David's heart burn brighter than his crown? And why does his name still tremble through prayer and poetry alike? Stay and remember with me, for within David's story lies your own forgotten melody, how the soul learns to rise after breaking. By the end of this night, you will not only know the man after God's heart, you will feel that heart beating within your own. If your soul remembers the light, stay with us. Subscribe and walk this ancient path once more. Each word you hear is a candle together. We rekindle what the world has forgotten. Let us remember David, and in remembering him, remember ourselves. Before crowns, before wars, before songs were carved into stone, there was a boy, and his breath beneath the stars. The hills of Bethlehem lay hushed under the weight of night, and the sheep moved like clouds adrift across the earth. David's hands were calloused from the staff, his feet bare with dust and dew, but his eyes were open to the language of heaven. He did not know yet that he was chosen. He only knew that the world sang softly when he listened. The moon brushed silver across the fields, and the wind carried stories older than men. David tilted his head to hear them. Sometimes he thought the earth itself was praying, the rustle of olive leaves, the sigh of the river in the dark. And when fear came, as it always did in the lonely hours, he would pluck his harp, letting the strings shimmer like starlight until even fear fell asleep beside him. It was not music he played, it was remembrance, a sound that made the invisible near again. He had no teacher, no temple, no crown. Yet heaven was nearer to that boy than it was to any king. In his solitude, he learned what priests could not teach, that the silence of the world was the first scripture, that to watch the dawn with wonder was already prayer. Each morning, when the first light kissed the stones, he whispered thanks, not because he had been told to, but because something within him trembled at beauty. That trembling would one day shake nations. The village saw only a shepherd's son, small, gentle, easily forgotten. But God saw the song in him, the rhythm of mercy hidden in his pulse. And so the boy grew in secret grace, learning to love what others ignored. The trembling lamb, the quiet brook, the stillness before the storm. When lions came for his flock, he stood unafraid, not because he trusted his sling, but because he trusted the still voice that had always whispered, "I am with you." One night, the stars seemed closer than ever. David lay on his back, the harp beside him, his hand resting over his chest as if to steady the heartbeat beneath. "Why do you hide in silence?" he murmured to the sky. "Why do you let the wicked roam?" His voice cracked young, but filled with a yearning too old for his years. No answer came, only wind and stars. Yet he knew in the marrow of his bones that the silence itself was the answer, for silence was how God began every song. He learned that waiting was not emptiness, but invitation, that patience was the slow music of faith. And so, beneath the vast, indifferent sky, the boy began to dream of things unseen, of kingdoms born from kindness, of thrones built not of stone, but of forgiveness. He did not know these dreams would one day come for him, for now they rested in his chest like sleeping lions. When morning broke, the sheep stirred, and the horizon opened like a wound of light. David rose, staff in hand, breath misting in the chill air. He sang a psalm no one heard, a prayer made of dew and dust. "Yahweh, my shepherd, I shall not want." The first line came not from thought, but from remembrance, as if whispered to him from before his birth. And so, before the crown, before the sword, before the psalms that would carry his name into eternity, there was this: a boy and his God, alone among the fields, speaking through silence, learning that love is first found not in glory, but in stillness. As seasons passed, David's world remained small, a ring of hills, a river that whispered secrets, and a flock that depended upon his gentle strength. Yet within that narrow circle lay an endless universe. Each sunrise was a revelation, each raindrop a psalm waiting to be sung. The boy began to feel that his quiet labor guiding, guarding, tending was a reflection of something vast and unseen. The same care with which he lifted a lamb from a thorn bush was, he imagined, the way God lifted souls from despair. Sometimes, when storms rolled over the plain, he stood unmoving, rain soaking his hair and tunic, and felt both tiny and eternal. The thunder was not anger, but music. The lightning not wrath, but the handwriting of heaven across the sky. And in that trembling light, he sensed a promise, that he too would be called to strike against darkness, not with might, but with the courage born of listening. At night, while the village slept, he sang to keep the wolves away, soft songs that made even predators pause. His melodies drifted across the valley and mingled with the cry of owls until the whole world seemed to hum with the same fragile hope. He did not yet know these psalms would one day heal the weary and comfort kings. He sang not for glory, but because silence asked for company. There were moments when he doubted himself, when loneliness pressed so heavy it felt like the weight of an unspoken prophecy. Yet, even in doubt, his heart beat steady. The rhythm of faith is not always triumph. It is the persistence of wonder when reason sleeps. He began to sense that the voice of God was not a shout from heaven, but a stirring within the heart that refuses to grow cold. One twilight, as the sky blushed into gold, David saw an old ram caught in thorns. He freed it carefully, bleeding his own hands on the sharp branches. The animal trembled and then rested its head against his knee. In that moment, he understood something wordless, that leadership was not domination, but tenderness that bleeds willingly. A lesson carved deep, preparing him for thrones he could not yet imagine. And so, the boy who kept sheep also kept secrets, that holiness hides in the ordinary, that greatness is born from gentleness, and that every whispered prayer ripples through eternity like wind across wheat. When night returned, he lay once more beneath the constellations, eyes half closed, listening to the earth breathe. He did not seek visions, yet sometimes they came flashes of cities, of battlefields, of tears and songs, shadows of a destiny he could not name. He did not fear them. He only whispered, "Let it be as you will," and sleep took him like a blessing. The stars burned on, old and patient, and somewhere beyond them, heaven smiled upon its smallest king, to be the shepherd who learned to rule by first learning to listen. Morning rose again, tender and gold, painting the stones of Bethlehem in the color of promise. The fields shimmered with dew like 1,000 tiny mirrors, each reflecting the quiet majesty of the Creator. David walked among them, staff in hand, every breath a prayer. The sheep followed in a calm procession, trusting his voice, his steps, his stillness. And though he looked like any boy tending his flock, there was something set apart in the way he moved, as if heaven itself had slowed its rhythm to match his. He began to notice how creation spoke in patterns. The circling of birds, the drifting of clouds, the unbroken patience of rivers carving stone. In these, he felt the pulse of eternity steady, unhurried, alive. His heart began to mirror it. He learned that faith was not the loud cry of certainty, but the quiet endurance of trust. That waiting was its own kind of worship. One afternoon, the horizon burned with dust and sunlight as a lion crept from the brush. David felt the earth tighten beneath his feet. The flock stirred in fear. Time slowed, and within the stillness, he heard it, that same voice from the silence, the one that had always been with him. It did not shout, it whispered, "Do not run." He moved as though guided by wind. The sling spun once, twice, then sang through the air. When the stone found its mark, the beast fell not slain by human strength, but by faith's calm precision. And when David placed his hand on the lion's mane, he did not boast. He only breathed gratitude, for he knew that courage was merely obedience to the whisper that says, "Fear not." That night, as the stars rose like candles in the vast cathedral of the sky, he sang once more, but now the song was different. It carried something new, the quiet authority of one who had met fear and found peace instead. His voice was no longer just the sound of a shepherd, it was becoming the echo of a king. In the distance, the lights of Bethlehem flickered like forgotten prayers. David watched them from his hillside, feeling both apart and chosen. He wondered if the God who spoke in silence ever felt lonely too. He did not know that this empathy, this aching compassion, would become the truest strength of his reign. He lay back against the grass, the harp resting across his chest. The strings caught the night breeze, trembling softly, playing themselves as if the wind wanted to join his song. Above, the stars seemed to shimmer closer, and he thought he could almost hear them breathing the slow, eternal heartbeat of creation. He whispered, barely audible, "If I find you in stillness, then let me never seek you in noise." And so, in the quiet hours of youth, before prophecy found him, before the oil of kingship touched his brow, the soul of David was forged in silence, not as a warrior, but as a listener. He did not yet know that heaven was preparing its psalmist, that every breath, every note, every whispered prayer beneath those desert moons would one day become scripture sung by countless generations. For now, he was simply the boy who heard God in the wind and answered with music. And somewhere beyond the veil of the night sky, the Eternal smiled, for the shepherd of silence had begun his song. The valley of Elah was heavy with fear. Soldiers trembled behind their shields, their courage withered beneath the voice of a single man. Goliath, vast, armored, unshaken, mocked the trembling ranks of Israel. His laughter rolled like thunder, echoing between the hills, until even faith seemed to falter. 40 days the giant called, and 40 nights his shadow grew longer. No one answered, no one dared, and then came the shepherd. He was not sent as a warrior. He carried no sword, no armor, no claim of power, only bread, cheese, and obedience to his father's errand. Yet when David heard the mockery, when he saw the fear that chained the hearts of Israel, something ancient stirred within him. It was not pride, it was a remembrance. The same still voice that spoke in the fields now whispered again, "Go." They laughed at him, the boy with sunburnt skin and eyes too bright for battle. His brothers called him foolish, the soldiers called him small. But heaven had always favored small things, the mustard seed, the whisper, the stone. David's courage did not come from strength, but from intimacy. He had met fear before and learned its true name, illusion. When Saul placed his armor upon him, the weight felt wrong. It clanged with doubt, suffocating the freedom of faith. David removed it gently, saying, "I cannot wear what was not forged for me." He chose instead his sling and 5 smooth stones from the brook, each one turning in his hand like a silent promise. The soldiers watched as he stepped into the valley, a lamb walking toward a lion. The air grew still. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Goliath's laughter broke the silence, mocking the boy who dared approach. "Am I a dog," he thundered, "that you come to me with sticks?" David's voice was calm, clear, carried by the wind. "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." It was not defiance, it was devotion. His words did not challenge the giant. They summoned heaven to stand beside him. He drew a single stone from his pouch, smooth as mercy, weightless as grace. The sling turned once, twice, and then time itself seemed to pause. The stone flew small, silent, unremarkable, yet guided by eternity's aim. It struck between pride and breath, and the giant fell like a mountain remembering its dust. The valley did not roar, it breathed. Even the wind bowed low. David stood over the fallen giant, and the soldiers' disbelief turned to awe. In that moment, the world learned again what the boy already knew, that faith, when pure, bends the laws of fear. He did not see himself as a hero or conqueror. He simply whispered a quiet thanks and lifted his eyes to the horizon, where dawn broke over the hills of Judah like a crown of light. He had not slain Goliath to prove his worth, but to remind Israel of theirs, that courage is not born of might, but of memory. For those who remember who walks beside them can face any giant and still sing. And somewhere in the silence after the battle, David heard it again, that soft, familiar pulse beneath the noise of triumph. "Be still, I am with you." When the dust settled and the sun rose higher over the valley, David's heart was not filled with victory but with quiet awe. He looked upon the fallen giant, upon the armies frozen in disbelief, and felt no joy in conquest, only stillness. The battle had never truly been between two men. It was between fear and remembrance, and fear had fallen. The soldiers of Israel erupted in shouts, but David's mind was far away still in the moment when the stone left his sling, when time itself seemed to pause and breathe with him. He remembered the calm that filled him then, like wind through olive trees. That calm, he knew, was not his own. It was borrowed from the presence that had never left him since the fields of his youth. He walked slowly across the valley floor, the grass bending beneath his steps, the silence so heavy it seemed sacred. He looked at Goliath's fallen sword, gleaming in the morning light, and for the first time he understood the strange burden of triumph. Power was a dangerous thing. It changed men more than battle ever could. He lifted the sword only once, to honor the moment, and then let it fall back to the earth as if to say, "Let strength remain in dust and faith remain in light." When he turned back toward the army, the faces that had mocked him now bowed in reverence. Saul's gaze lingered, torn between wonder and unease. David felt it the beginning of envy's shadow, faint but forming, yet he did not dwell on it. He only thought of home, of his father's eyes, his mother's gentle hands, the sheep that waited beneath the open sky. He was still that boy, still the shepherd. The giant's fall had not changed who he was. It had revealed what he already carried within. That night, as they journeyed back toward the city, the women sang through the streets, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Their voices rose like incense into the dusk. But praise, like victory, did not rest easily on David's spirit. He knew songs were fragile things. They could lift men to glory, and they could turn hearts to stone. He bowed his head and whispered a psalm under his breath. "Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to your name give glory." When sleep came, it came heavy and dream-filled. He saw the face of the giant again, but not as an enemy, as a mirror. The same pride that had felled Goliath lived quietly in every man. And in the dream, David heard the whisper of the voice that had always guided him. "Guard your heart, shepherd of Israel, for the giants you will one day fight will not stand before you, they will live within you." He woke before dawn, trembling. The camp was still, the fire reduced to embers. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had played the harp, that had slain the lion, that now had brought down a giant. They seemed both holy and dangerous. Power was awakening around him, but deeper still, humility stirred the reminder that every gift, if not guarded by grace, could become a weapon. So he knelt beside the fading fire and prayed as light returned to the hills. "Let my strength be yours, and not my own. Let every victory return to silence." And as the wind moved softly through the valley once more, David felt at peace. For even in the aftermath of battle, he had remembered the one truth that would sustain him through every storm to come, that the mightiest warrior is still, first and last, a shepherd of the soul. In the days that followed, David became a name that lived upon every tongue. Children whispered it in the markets. Elders spoke it in awe. Even kings turned their eyes toward the boy who had silenced terror with a single stone. Yet within David's heart, there was no crown, no trumpet, no hunger for the praise of men, only a quiet bewilderment at how swiftly the world could change when God decided it was time. He walked among the soldiers who now looked to him as if he carried light itself. Some asked about his weapon, his technique, his courage. But David only smiled faintly and said, "The battle was not mine." For he knew it was not the sling that had found its mark, it was the unseen hand of the Eternal, moving through his obedience. Saul summoned him again, his face both grateful and guarded. The king's eyes searched David's as if to find the source of his calm. He asked of the shepherd's youth, of the lion and the bear, and of the song that had carried him through the valley. David spoke little, and when words came, they were soft. He told Saul that God does not measure a man by his stature, but by the stillness of his heart. The king nodded, though his spirit trembled. Somewhere beneath his robes and his crown, jealousy began to stir like smoke from a distant fire. David was brought into Saul's house to dwell among the court and play the harp when torment fell upon the king. The palace smelled of cedar and oil, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of servants and soldiers. Yet amidst the splendor, David's heart ached for the open fields. He longed for the language of crickets, the laughter of rivers, the hush of stars. Still, he obeyed. He played when called, and when his fingers touched the strings, the shadows fled. His music did not entertain, it healed, for within his melodies lived the same stillness that had once conquered the giant. There were nights when Saul would awaken from dreams of war and find David still by the window, playing softly to the dawn. The harp's notes drifted through the air like dust in sunlight, carrying peace to every corner of the room. Even the guards outside would fall quiet, listening as the young shepherd wove heaven into sound. But peace is a fragile guest in the house of kings. Whispers began to follow him, murmurs of destiny, of prophecy. Some said Samuel had once spoken of a new king rising, and though David did not seek it, the rumor clung to him like fragrance to his garments. He returned often to the hills to remember. He would kneel in the grass, eyes closed, the sling still hanging at his side, untouched since that day in the valley. There he would thank the one who had guided his hand and silenced his fear. He did not ask for kingdoms or glory. He asked only to remain pure of heart, to never mistake the gift for the giver. In those moments of solitude, he came to understand that every victory carries a hidden test, whether a soul will exalt itself or return its triumph to the source of all things. The true danger of Goliath was never his sword, it was the temptation that followed his fall. So David sang again, his voice rising with the wind. "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" And the valley answered with stillness. The stone that felled the giant now rested in his pouch, a small, silent witness to the truth he had always known. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the memory of God's nearness. And as the sun sank beyond the western hills, painting the sky in hues of ember and mercy, David closed his eyes. The world was changing, and so was he. Yet within him the shepherd's heart remained tender, watchful, and attuned to the quiet voice that would one day lead him from pasture to palace. For now, he was content to wait the boy who had slain a giant, resting once more in the silence that first taught him how to believe. The palace was colder than the hills, though its walls gleamed with gold. David walked its corridors softly, his harp slung over his shoulder like an old friend, the echo of his footsteps following him through the silence. Every corner smelled of power, incense, oil, and the unspoken fear that always lingers where crowns are kept. He had not sought this place. He missed the scent of grass, the laughter of rivers, the quiet company of sheep. Yet now his harp was the only thing that could calm the storms inside a king. When Saul's mind darkened, when the weight of his crown became too heavy to bear, it was David who was called. And so, night after night, the boy would sit beside the trembling ruler, his fingers weaving light into sound. The music was not merely melody, it was mercy. It carried no ambition, no demand, only the memory of a field beneath the stars and a boy who had once spoken with God in silence. Each note fell like rain upon the king's troubled spirit, washing away the shadows, if only for a while. But beneath the peace, something began to shift. At first, it was only a glance, the way Saul's eyes lingered on him too long, half admiration, half unease. Then it grew into whispers. The women sang in the streets, and their songs reached the palace gates. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. The words were innocent, but they pierced the king's pride like arrows. Jealousy entered quietly, but once inside, it did not leave. David felt the change before he understood it. The air around Saul grew heavy. The silences stretched longer. The king's smile turned brittle, like glass ready to break. One night, as David played, Saul's hand gripped the spear beside his throne. A flicker of madness passed through his eyes, brief but bright as lightning. The music faltered for a heartbeat, but David kept playing, his song turning softer, almost like a prayer. Let mercy reign where envy burns. And for that night it did. But the shadow had been born. Soon, Saul would look at David not as his healer, but as his threat. Still, David remained not out of fear, but out of faith. He knew that every calling walks hand in hand with suffering. The God who had given him victory over lions and giants now asked him to face the more hidden battle, to love a man who hated him, to sing for one who wished him silent. In those nights, when the palace slept, David would step outside to the terraces overlooking Jerusalem. He would play softly to the stars, his harp catching the moonlight. The music rose like incense, carrying his confusion, his longing, his hurt. And heaven listened. He whispered to the night, "Why, Lord, do you anoint me for peace and surround me with war? Why do you let love turn to jealousy?" And the night whispered back, "Because even shadows must learn your song." So David played for Saul, for himself, for the silence that had once comforted him. The same strings that soothed the king now steadied his own trembling heart. His gift had become his refuge, his worship, his armor. In the king's shadow, David's soul deepened. Pain pressed him into humility. Rejection refined his tenderness. Each wound became a doorway through which grace entered more freely. He was no longer just a shepherd or a hero. He was becoming a psalm. And though Saul's eyes watched him with growing fury, David never returned it. He only sang, as one who knows that vengeance does not belong to man. His melodies were not defense, but devotion. For he had learned that the truest strength is not in striking, but in staying, not in power, but in peace. And somewhere deep in the silence between their breaths, even Saul, broken, tormented, fading, felt it too, that this boy carried something greater than kingdoms. He carried the remembrance of God's gentleness. The palace began to breathe uneasily. Rumors crept like smoke through its chambers that the hand of God had departed from Saul and rested upon the shepherd instead. No one spoke it aloud before the king, but fear has its own language, and Saul understood it perfectly. He watched David from afar now, through the shimmer of torchlight, through the veil of his own unrest. The harp that once brought him peace now stirred unease. Every note seemed to remind him of what he had lost: the favor, the fire, the quiet assurance of God's nearness. And so envy, once a spark, became a storm. David felt it but did not defend himself. He only played softer, letting his songs become prayers for the one who sought his harm. He sang not to survive, but to remember, for he knew that every melody born in suffering carries more truth than any song of triumph. At times, when the shadows thickened and the air trembled with tension, David would pause between chords, close his eyes, and breathe the name of God. It steadied him. It reminded him that his place was not to conquer Saul, but to love him, to serve, until heaven released him. Then came the day the spear flew. The court was silent, the musicians still, the servants frozen mid-breath. David had been playing softly, eyes lowered, the melody gentle as light through linen. Without warning, Saul rose, his face pale, his mind aflame, and hurled the weapon with a cry that sounded more like grief than anger. The spear struck the wall beside David, quivering there, humming with the echo of madness. Time stopped. David did not move. He looked at the trembling shaft, then at the man he had once called Lord, Father, King. No hatred filled him, only sorrow. The boy who had once slain giants now faced the greater test, to stand before wrath and not return it. He left the palace quietly that night, slipping through its golden doors, as one leaving a temple desecrated by pride. The streets of Gibeah were still, save for the faint sound of his harp tied to his back, its strings whispering in the wind. He did not curse the king, he prayed for him. And with each step into exile, David felt both loss and liberation, the strange grace of being stripped of safety so that faith might breathe again. He wandered the outskirts of the land, the stars once more his ceiling, the earth his bed. It felt like home. Yet even there, he carried the weight of Saul's shadow, the wound of being hated by one he served with love. In that pain, psalms began to take shape, songs that would one day cradle the sorrow of nations. He sang them into the night, each one born of exile and mercy. When I am afraid, I will trust in you. When my enemies surround me, still I will sing. The fields listened, the sky wept dew, and heaven gathered his words, storing them like seeds for generations yet to come. For in the wilderness of rejection, the shepherd was becoming something greater, not a warrior, not yet a king, but a vessel for divine lament. His heart was being carved by love's hardest lesson, that even those who wound you can be the instruments through which God tunes your soul. And as dawn broke upon the horizon, soft and golden, David lifted his eyes to the hills where he had once tended sheep. He realized, with a calm that could only come from grace, that the same silence which had begun his journey had returned to guide him again. He whispered into the wind, "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." And the valley of fear became once more the field of faith. David's exile did not end with the night. It became a season long and wandering, stitched together by prayer and dust. He hid among caves and lonely hills, the same wild lands that had once been his home. But now the silence felt heavier. It was no longer the stillness of peace, but the ache of pursuit. For Saul had turned his jealousy into obsession, and his armies into hunters. Yet even in flight, David's heart refused bitterness. He gathered the lost and the weary men who had been cast out, broken by debt or despair, and he led them, not as a general, but as a shepherd still. He spoke to them by firelight, his voice soft but certain. We will not be ruled by anger. Even now we belong to mercy. And they followed him not for conquest, but because his peace steadied their chaos. In that wilderness of fugitives, a strange kind of kingdom began to form, one bound not by law or crown, but by trust and tenderness. Sometimes, when the camp slept, David walked alone into the ravines and prayed beneath the stars. He did not ask for victory, he asked for restraint, for though Saul hunted him, David could not raise his hand against the king. Twice he was given the chance, once in a cave, once in a camp, and twice he spared him. He only cut a piece of Saul's robe, then wept, as if he had wounded a friend. "God forbid," he whispered, "that I should harm the one he anointed." The men could not understand. They wanted justice, but David sought something higher, the justice of patience, the vengeance of grace. He had learned that sometimes the truest strength is not striking down your enemy, but laying down the right too. The night after sparing Saul in the cave, David sat alone on a rock overlooking the valley. The moon hung low, its light silvering the fields below. He lifted his harp and began to play, but the song came differently this time, broken, trembling, like a prayer that had forgotten its words. He sang not of victory, but of mercy. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, and see if there is any wicked way in me." The wind carried the melody down the slopes, over the sleeping army that sought his life. And though no one heard it, heaven did. For in that fragile song, David offered the truest worship, obedience without reward. Days turned into months, months into years. David's name still haunted Saul's dreams, his psalms still haunted heaven's silence. Yet through it all, he remained faithful, shaping his sorrow into praise. He began to understand that exile was not punishment, it was preparation. The wilderness was the furnace of kingship, the classroom of the soul. It was here, stripped of safety, that he learned to rule not with pride, but with empathy, not from thrones, but from wounds. Sometimes, when dawn came slowly and soft across the desert, David would remember his youth, the fields of Bethlehem, the lambs, the harp's first song beneath the stars. He realized that those quiet days had never ended. They had only changed form. The pasture had become a battlefield, the sheep had become men, and the voice of God still spoke through silence. And so, though hunted, though tired, though far from peace, he whispered once more to the wind that had always carried his prayers. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The words did not echo. They settled, like dew upon the heart. For the shadow that had once tried to kill him had instead taught him how to walk with light. And in that moment, David understood the strange mercy of his suffering, that even in the shadow of envy, even in the pursuit of death, the song of God had not left him. It had only grown deeper, quieter, holier. The rain had followed him for days. It whispered across the stones and soaked the earth until even the caves seemed to weep. David and his men took shelter in the darkness of Adullam, a hollow place carved by time, wide enough to hold despair. The torches flickered, painting the walls in trembling gold. Around him lay the weary, the outcast, the forgotten, and among them the anointed king who owned no throne. David sat apart, his harp across his knees, silent still. He had no song for this place, no melody for exile. The crown promised by Samuel now seemed like a dream spoken by a stranger. Here there was only waiting and the ache of unanswered prayers. But it was here, in this cavern of shadows, that he learned the truest face of kingship. The men around him were broken. Farmers turned to fugitives, beggars turned to soldiers, all bound by the thread of his quiet faith. They called him leader, though he wore no crown. They followed him, not for what he had, but for who he was when all was taken. The firelight trembled across his face, and he looked at them, each soul carrying the same hunger, the same bruised hope. He spoke softly, as one remembering, "Do not despise this cave. God often builds his temples in places men abandon." His words settled over them like warm rain. Some wept, others bowed their heads. For they had seen in David's eyes a reflection of their own longing, that even in despair there could be purpose. When the night deepened, David wandered to the cave's mouth. The storm had calmed, and the moon broke through the clouds like mercy through grief. The valley below shimmered in mist. He knelt there, feeling the cool breath of the wind on his skin, and whispered, "Why, Lord, do you hide your promise in darkness? You said I would be king, yet I am hunted, cornered, alone." The silence answered him, as it always did, patient, unhurried, eternal. And in that silence, something shifted. David felt not the absence of God, but his weight, a presence too vast to name. The cave was no longer his prison, it was his womb. Inside, his men stirred in their sleep, and he realized this darkness was forming them. The crown that glittered in prophecy was not made of gold, but of mercy learned through suffering. He closed his eyes and saw again the face of Saul, once father, now foe. The memory still stung, but David's heart refused hatred. "Forgive him," he whispered, "as you forgive me." And so the cave became holy, a sanctuary of the broken, a forge for the humble, a hidden altar where the shepherd king learned that greatness is not the power to rule, but the strength to kneel. The wind carried through the cavern, soft and low, stirring the embers. David lifted his harp at last, and a single note rang out, faint, trembling, pure. The men woke and listened. It was not a song of war nor triumph, but of surrender. He sang of the God who hides in darkness, the one who anoints not in palaces, but in caves. He sang of the heart that breaks to be remade. He sang until his voice became prayer, and the prayer became peace. And when the final note faded into the stone, even the silence seemed to bow, David lowered his harp and looked toward the cave's mouth, where dawn began to whisper upon the horizon. He smiled faintly. He was still without a kingdom, yet somehow he was already a king. Dawn crept into the cave like a shy visitor, tracing the edges of the stone with fingers of gold. The men stirred, their faces pale with hunger and sleeplessness. Outside, the valley steamed with the breath of rain, and the scent of wet earth filled the air, a smell that carried both death and renewal. David stood at the mouth of the cave, staff in hand, his eyes turned toward the distant hills of Judah. Somewhere beyond them waited Saul, still hunting the one who prayed for him. A messenger arrived that morning, breathless, trembling, his clothes torn. He brought word from the priest of Nob that Saul's wrath had spilled even into sanctuaries. The priests who had given David bread and shelter were slain. Their blood had touched the altar. For a long while, David said nothing. His face was calm, but his silence held sorrow deeper than speech. "This is the cost of my anointing," he murmured. "Others bleed for what I have been promised." He walked back into the cave, the light following behind him like a hesitant friend. His men watched as he knelt before the fire, bowing his head into his hands. He prayed not for revenge, but for understanding. "If the crown is born of blood, then let it not be theirs. Let me carry it instead." That night, he sat apart again, shaping his grief into music. His harp strings trembled with the storm of his heart. The melody that came was unlike any he had played before, raw, fragile, unfinished. It spoke of loss that had no name and faith that refused to die. The men listened from afar, their eyes reflecting the firelight and tears. When the song ended, none spoke, for the cave itself seemed to have heard and grown still in reverence. Days passed, and hunger deepened, but so did their brotherhood. In the darkness, laughter returned in small, unexpected bursts. They shared bread when they had it, silence when they did not, and slowly they began to see what David saw, that this place of exile was also a place of becoming. One evening, while the sky burned red with sunset, a stranger approached the cave, a prophet named Gad. His eyes were fierce with light, his robe heavy with dust. He bowed before David and spoke softly, "Leave this stronghold and go to the land of Judah. The Lord says your time of hiding will not last forever." David looked into the prophet's eyes and saw no promise of ease, only the certainty of purpose. He nodded. "Then let it be so." That night, he told his men to prepare. They would leave the safety of the cave and walk once more into danger, not because they sought it, but because obedience had called. The men obeyed, their trust in him deeper than fear. Before they departed, David turned one last time to the walls that had held his tears and songs. He placed his palm against the stone and whispered, "You have been my fortress, my teacher, my altar. May every man who hides here find what I found, that the lowest place is still holy ground." When he stepped out into the dawn, the wind caught his hair, the sun crowned him in pale fire, and the birds rose in sudden flight. The cave stood behind him, silent and eternal, its darkness now filled with the echoes of hope. And as David led his men down the valley path, he carried no sword, no crown, only faith. The kind that is born not in victory, but in the quiet endurance of those who have learned to trust the silence of God. The path from Adullam wound through dry hills and thorny scrub. Each step echoed softly in the morning air, mingling with the cries of distant ravens. David led his small band forward, his gaze steady though his heart bore the weight of many griefs. The cave had given him refuge, but now the road would test what the shadows had taught. They moved through villages half ruined by fear, where the people whispered Saul's name with bitterness and hid their bread in silence. When they saw David, they did not see a fugitive. They saw a glimmer of hope, the kindness in his eyes, a reminder that not all power devoured. Mothers offered him water. Old men lifted trembling hands in blessing. He bowed to each, humbled by their trust. But at night, when the stars returned, memories came to haunt him. The priests of Nob, the spear quivering in the palace wall, the face of Saul part rage, part sorrow. He prayed by the firelight until his voice broke, and in the breaking, peace would come. "Let my heart not grow hard," he whispered, "for hardness is the true exile." Soon he found refuge in the forest of Hereth. The trees were tall and kind. Their leaves sang in the wind like choirs unseen. There he built an altar of stones and gathered his men to pray. Their voices rose uncertainly, yet in the trembling was beauty. David taught them the old songs, the ones of trust and remembrance, and though many did not know the words, they learned the rhythm of mercy. Days blurred into weeks. Once, when they were starving, a messenger came from Keilah, pleading for aid. The Philistines had attacked the threshing floors, and the city was crying out. David's men feared the risk. "If Saul hunts us here, and we face the Philistines there, what hope will remain?" But David turned his face to the hills and sought the counsel of God. The answer came as wind through leaves. "Go, deliver them." And so they went, fewer than 600, poorly armed but rich in faith. They descended upon the fields, striking swiftly, scattering the enemy. Keilah was freed, its grain reclaimed. Yet the cost of compassion soon found them. Saul heard of David's deed and marched to trap him there. When word reached David, his men trembled, but he only said, "Then God will move again." He took nothing from the city but gratitude and vanished into the wilderness before the king could arrive. The pattern of his life repeated, victory followed by flight, song followed by silence. Each act of mercy seemed to call forth new suffering, yet still he chose it, for he had learned that love without cost is not love, but comfort. One night, while his men slept beneath the trees, David sat awake and spoke softly to the darkness. "If I must lose everything to keep my heart, then let it be so. For a crown without compassion is only a chain of gold." The words lingered in the air long after he fell silent. Somewhere deep among the branches, an owl called once, twice, as if in answer. And as dawn crept between the trunks, painting the forest floor with light, David rose to pray again. His hands were rough, his clothes torn, his face lined with weariness, yet his eyes shone with that same quiet fire that had burned in Bethlehem's fields, the fire of one who listens more than he speaks. He knew now that the cave had been only the beginning. That true kingship was not conferred by oil or prophecy, but by the patient shaping of the soul through loss and mercy. And so he walked onward, deeper into the wilderness, carrying with him nothing but the song that would not die. It was not triumph that kept him moving, it was remembrance, the memory of stillness, the faith that every valley of shadows is only the prelude to dawn. And as the sun rose behind him, lighting the hills in hues of amber and grace, the shepherd who would be king walked forward once more, unarmed, unthroned, yet already crowned in spirit. Years had passed since the cave. The boy who once wandered the hills with a harp and sling was now a man, his face carved by sorrow and sunlight alike. The songs he sang were deeper, slower, touched by a gravity that only suffering can teach. He had buried friends, fled from kings, and learned that promise is not fulfillment, it is fire, and the heart must be tempered to hold it. When the word came that Saul had fallen, David did not rejoice. He tore his garments and wept. He wept for the man who had once loved him, for the father he never truly had, for the king whose jealousy had shaped his exile. News of victory reached him like a wound. For David understood what few ever learn, that when your enemy dies, a part of you dies too, the part that was forged in his shadow. He composed a lament for Saul and Jonathan, his voice breaking as he sang, "How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. O Jonathan, you were slain in your high places. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women." And as he sang, the valley answered with silence. The people mourned, but only David's tears reached heaven. For his grief was not political, it was pure. In the days that followed, the tribes of Judah gathered around him, asking him to reign. They anointed him in Hebron, pouring oil upon his head until it glistened like sunrise. It was the same oil Samuel had poured long ago, but it felt heavier now, almost alive. It carried with it every trial, every exile, every prayer spoken through clenched teeth. The anointing was not triumph, it was surrender. As the oil dripped down his brow, David felt both light and burden at once. The whisper of God returned. Now rule, not as the world rules, rule as a shepherd does. And so began the slow awakening of his reign. He rebuilt what was broken, restored the scattered, and sought to unify what Saul's fear had divided. Yet, with the throne came temptation, quiet, golden, insidious, for power always tests the gentleness it crowns. David walked through the palace of Hebron, his sandals brushing over marble floors, and he remembered the dirt of Bethlehem beneath his feet. He missed the ache of simplicity, the days when the only weight he bore was a harp. Now, every decision bore the lives of thousands. Each judgment was a stone placed upon the altar of his conscience. Still, he ruled with wisdom, for he had been shaped by suffering. He listened to the people as he once listened to sheep, hearing their fear before their words. He showed mercy where others would have shown might, and the nation began to breathe again. Peace, fragile and bright, bloomed across the land like spring after famine. But in the quiet hours, when the courtyards were empty and the lamps burned low, David would step onto the roof of his house and gaze toward the horizon. He wondered if God still walked as near as he once had in the fields. The songs came slower now, their notes caught between gratitude and longing. He would whisper them into the night. You lifted me from the pit and set me upon a rock. Teach me, Lord, to stand without forgetting the dust. And though he was king, though his name was sung in every corner of the land, he felt the old ache, the ache of distance from the one who had chosen him. For sometimes, the closer a man walks to glory, the fainter the voice of grace becomes. He turned his eyes to the stars and breathed deeply, as he once had beneath the open sky. I am still your shepherd, even here, he whispered. Teach me again how to listen. And the wind passed over the rooftops, gentle as memory. For heaven was not far, it was only quiet. And David, now anointed king, began to feel the weight of light. The throne had no cushion for his heart. David soon learned that crowns glimmer in the sun, but cut in the dark. He sat upon cedar and gold, yet longed for the rough bark of olive trees, the scent of wild thyme in the air. The palace was filled with courtiers and counsel, but silence was rarer now. Every voice around him spoke of strategy, allegiance, tribute. Few spoke of God. In the early years of his reign, David led his armies not from arrogance, but from necessity. He fought not to conquer, but to secure peace for his people. Each battle won felt less like triumph, and more like toll, the slow sacrifice of innocence for the safety of others. When his men sang victory songs, he heard lament beneath them, for he knew that every sword raised in victory still casts a shadow. After one long campaign, David returned to Jerusalem, the city he had long dreamed of building into a resting place for the Ark of the Covenant. He danced before it as it entered the gates, his body moving like wind and fire, unashamed, unrestrained. The people watched, astonished, for their king had forgotten his dignity and remembered his joy. He spun until the hem of his robe shimmered in dust and sunlight, and the music of trumpets rose like prayer. When night came and the city slept, David lingered beside the ark. The gold gleamed faintly in the torchlight, and he felt the presence he had missed since the pastures of his youth. He knelt, bowing low, his voice trembling with gratitude. I dwell in a house of cedar, he whispered, but you dwell in a tent. Let me build you a home worthy of your name. The prophet Nathan came to him the next day, eyes deep as still water, and he said, You shall not build the house, David. Your hands have shed blood, but your son shall build it, and your line shall endure forever. David bowed his head and accepted the word with peace. He had learned, through many winters, that God's promises are not chains of pride, but rivers flowing where he wills. That night, David wrote another psalm, one not of lament or battle, but of release. He sang softly, "Who am I, Lord, that you have brought me this far? You know your servant. You know his heart. Let your name be magnified forever." The harp rested across his knees, its strings shimmering in the lamplight like threads of dawn. Each note reminded him that kingship was not possession, it was stewardship. He was keeper of a people, not their owner, singer of a promise that belonged to all. Still, in the years that followed, shadows grew along the edges of his peace. Power began to whisper its old seduction. Comfort dulled his vigilance. And somewhere between justice and ease, David began to forget the hunger that once kept him close to God. He no longer rose with the dawn to pray among the hills. He lingered in the palace instead, surrounded by the scent of cedar and incense. The harp grew quiet for long stretches, and when he looked into the mirror of his heart, he found something faintly amiss like dust settling upon holy things. He walked one night through the corridors, unable to sleep, the moon pouring silver across the marble floors. He paused at a window and looked down upon the city, the rooftops glistening, the air still. Somewhere below, a woman bathed beneath the stars, unaware of the eyes that watched her. Desire stirred within him, subtle, soft, yet deep enough to shake the walls of his soul. He lingered too long, and in that moment, the light that had crowned him became heavy, almost unbearable. The man who once faced giants with faith now faced his own heart and found it unguarded. The night hung still, and the city slept. David remained at the window, the moon bright upon his face, his breath shallow as if caught between wonder and warning. Below, the woman bathed in silence, her movements slow, unaware of the eyes upon her. Her name, he would soon learn, was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, a soldier of honor who slept among the ranks while his king gazed upon his home. Desire, once a spark, became a flame that reason could not quench. For the first time, David's gaze was not prayer, it was hunger. He turned from the window, but the image remained, haunting him with every step. The man who had once conquered lust for vengeance now faltered before the gentler ruin of longing. He sent it to her, and when she came, she bowed low, not knowing she approached the edge of sorrow. The chambers of cedar were filled with the scent of myrrh and silence. Words were few, but eyes spoke all. What began as admiration ended as transgression, and when dawn arrived, the king of Israel rose from his bed, already cloaked in guilt. Days passed. The harp remained untouched. The songs that once filled the palace fell quiet, and his prayers turned shallow, hurried, uncertain. Sin has a sound, it is the absence of melody. When word came from Bathsheba that she was with child, David's heart clenched like stone. Fear replaced desire, shame replaced the thrill. He tried to cover the wound with cunning, summoning Uriah home, urging him to return to his wife. But Uriah refused, saying, "Shall I go to my house while my comrades dwell in the field?" Honor stood where the king had fallen, and David, desperate, devised what he dared not name. He sent Uriah back to the front, bearing his own death, sealed in a letter. And when the messenger returned, the report came cold. Uriah was slain. The battlefield had become David's mirror, his sin written in blood, where once he had written psalms. Bathsheba mourned, and when her days of grief were past, she came to the palace once more. David took her as wife. The city whispered, but none dared speak against the king. Only heaven remained silent, the kind of silence that trembles with withheld judgment. In the nights that followed, David lay awake, the air heavy with guilt. He felt the distance widening between his soul and the presence he once breathed like air. The same God who had delivered him from lions and giants now stood apart, watching. And in that watching, David felt the slow unraveling of his peace. The child was born a fragile, innocent thing, yet its cries carried sorrow. Bathsheba wept often, though she did not know why. And David, who once sang joy into the hearts of others, found no song left in himself. One evening, unable to bear the quiet, he took up his harp and struck its strings. The sound was hollow, lifeless. His fingers, once guided by grace, now trembled with remorse. And he realized then what sin had truly cost him. Not his throne, not his name, but the nearness of God, the sweetness of presence that had been his breath since boyhood was gone. He bowed his head into his hands and whispered, "How could I forget you, Lord? How could I trade the voice that called me from the fields for the whisper of desire?" The walls did not answer, but the silence carried sorrow deep enough to cleanse. And though he did not yet know it, redemption was already on its way, carried in the footsteps of a prophet who would come to him soon, bearing both truth and mercy. For the heart of David, though stained, still beat toward repentance, and the God who had chosen him was not finished with his song. The palace slept, but David could not. He walked its corridors like a ghost among his own memories, hearing faint echoes of music that no longer lived within him. The laughter of courtiers, the soft lull of harps, the rhythm of prayer, all had fallen silent. Only guilt spoke now, and it spoke with the voice of the one he had wronged. Every time he passed the doorway to the child's chamber, his breath caught. The boy was fragile, his cries faint, his eyes restless, as though he could already feel the fracture between heaven and earth. Bathsheba sat beside him through each night, her face pale with grief and exhaustion. David stood often at the threshold, unseen, unable to enter. Love and regret warred within him, and he knew neither could win. He thought of Uriah loyal, steadfast Uriah, whose name now clung to his conscience like ashes that will not wash away. David had killed with command what he could not confront within himself. He had turned his gift into a weapon against his own soul. The shepherd who once sang the wolves to sleep had become one. Then came the day the prophet entered. Nathan, calm and grave, stood before the throne with the authority of heaven upon his brow. He did not bow. He began to speak in parable, as prophets often do. There were two men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had flocks and herds without numbers. The poor man had but one little lamb, which he loved as a daughter. And when a traveler came, the rich man took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guest. David rose to his feet, anger blazing in his eyes. As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold. And then Nathan's voice fell like thunder wrapped in gentleness. "You are that man." Silence. The words hung between them like a sword. All the air seemed to leave the room. The king who had ruled armies and nations now stood conquered by truth. Nathan's gaze did not waver. "You have struck down Uriah and taken his wife. You have despised the command of God. The sword shall never depart from your house." David fell to his knees. No guards moved. No courtiers breathed. Only the sound of weeping filled the hall, deep, broken, ancient. He whispered, barely audible, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan's eyes softened, and his words came like rain upon scorched earth. "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die, but the child that is born to you shall surely pass." David bowed his head to the floor, trembling. It was not punishment he heard, it was consequence, the harvest of the seeds he had sown. And though his heart shattered, he did not argue. He knew that mercy often comes dressed as grief. That night, he stripped himself of robes and crowns and lay in ashes upon the palace floor. He neither ate nor spoke for 7 days, praying only that the child might live. Bathsheba wept beside him, her tears falling silently onto the earth that had once known their sin. And still, heaven was silent. When the child's cry ceased, the servants feared to tell him, but David saw their faces and knew. He rose, washed himself, changed his garments, and went into the house of God. And there he knelt, not as king, not as a poet, as a sinner who still believed in love. He whispered through the stillness, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew the right spirit within me." The words were not recited, they were born. They rose from the deepest wound of his life, and through that wound, mercy entered. The child was gone, but the song that would save countless hearts had begun. When David left the house of mourning, the sky above Jerusalem was quiet, washed pale with dawn. The city stirred beneath him, unaware that its king had died a little in the night, not in body, but in spirit. Something in him had broken that would never mend as before, yet in its breaking, he had found the beginnings of a truer wholeness. He walked to the roof where his fall had begun. The same moon that had witnessed his sin now hung dim against the fading stars. He stood there long, barefoot upon the cool stone, and whispered, "I remember." The wind moved through his hair like a benediction, neither forgiving nor condemning, only being like the presence of God itself. Bathsheba remained within the chamber of silence, her tears flowing without sound. She did not curse him, though she could have. She did not turn away. Instead, she sat with her grief as one who holds a flame too precious to extinguish, though it burns the hand that bears it. When David came to her, she did not rise, and he did not speak. They only sat together, the sinner and the sorrow, the wound and its mirror. No words could bridge such a chasm, but sometimes silence can carry more mercy than speech. Days turned into weeks. The child's name was no longer spoken, yet his absence filled the air. David began to write again, not songs of triumph or lament, but psalms that trembled between them. He wrote of the God who wounds to heal, who hides to be sought. He wrote not as a king seeking pardon, but as a man learning to be human again. Out of his repentance rose a quiet renewal. Bathsheba too began to heal. Her grief became a garden, watered by tears but seeded with grace. And in time, another child was born to them, a son named Solomon, meaning peace. David held him in trembling arms and whispered, "The Lord has loved you." For in the ashes of loss, God had kindled new light. The people, seeing the joy return to their king, rejoiced. But David's smile carried depth now, the kind that knows how quickly glory fades, how fragile joy must be held. He spent long hours in prayer, not asking for more, but thanking for what remained. His heart, once swollen with pride, had learned to bow in the rhythm of humility. He looked often upon the Ark of the Covenant and thought of how God had walked with him even in rebellion. He marveled that grace had not abandoned him when he had abandoned grace. From that wonder came his psalm, the one the weary still whisper centuries later. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." When he sang those words, they did not rise as defense, but as offering. Every syllable was a wound open to heaven, every breath a plea that love might outlast the ruin it allowed. And heaven answered, not with thunder, but with stillness, the same sacred quiet that had always been God's voice to him. In that quiet, David felt a peace unlike any he had known before. It was not the peace of innocence restored, but of guilt forgiven. The peace that comes not from forgetting, but from remembering rightly, remembering that even in sin, the heart that turns toward mercy finds its home again. He knelt there, beside the window where the light touched his face and whispered, "Broken I am, yet still yours, and that is enough." Outside, the city awoke to birdsong. Inside, the psalmist of sorrow became again the man after God's own heart, not because he was flawless, but because he finally understood how much love it takes for God to stay near to the flawed. Peace did not come swiftly. Though the palace grew quiet again, David's nights remained long. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the windows, seemed to carry the memory of the voice that had said, "You are that man." But now, that voice no longer condemned it, called him deeper, toward a faith stripped of pride and clothed in awe. He rose early each morning to pray before dawn. His servants would find him kneeling on the cold stone, lips moving not in command, but in confession. He did not pray to be restored as king, he prayed to be restored as son. He prayed that the nearness he once felt in the fields might return, that the silence might speak again. And slowly, it did. It came first as peace in the pauses between words, then as strength in the weight of stillness. David began to sense that repentance was not a moment, but a pilgrimage, a long road through the heart, back toward grace. Each step was a surrender, each breath an act of remembrance. He went often among his people, not as ruler, but as servant. He listened to their stories, shared their bread, and blessed their children. Those who had once seen him as distant now saw the gentleness that exile and failure had left behind. For the truest kingship, he had learned, is not in dominion, but in compassion. Bathsheba, too, was healing. Her grief had settled into quiet strength. Sometimes, in the hush of evening, she would find David by the child's resting place, his fingers tracing the carved letters of the name they dared not speak. She would place a hand on his shoulder, and for a time they would simply breathe, two souls stitched together by the thread of forgiveness. One night, a messenger brought news that their second son had spoken his first word. David went to him and knelt beside the cradle, the candlelight trembling over the child's face. Solomon's eyes were bright, wide, and calm eyes, like still water that holds the reflection of heaven. David smiled and whispered, "May you build what I could not. May your hands remain pure where mine have failed." And for the first time in many seasons, joy returned without guilt. He took up his harp again. The strings, silent for so long, quivered beneath his touch. The sound that came was not as bold as before. It was slower, humbler, more like breath than music. It was the sound of a man who had seen both the height of glory and the depth of grace. His psalm was no longer about victory or vengeance, but about the mercy that finds the lost. He sang, "Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will guide you with my eye." The words rose through the open window and drifted into the night, mingling with the wind. They carried no pride, no pretense, only truth, spoken softly enough for heaven to hear. And as David finished, he looked once more toward the stars that had guided him since boyhood. They were older now, and so was he. But their light still shimmered with the same message that even in failure, the promise remains. For God's covenant was not with David's perfection, but with his heart, a heart that, though broken, never stopped turning back toward love. The harp fell silent, the candle burned low, and in that sacred hush, David understood what all his life had been teaching him, that the wound is not the end, but the doorway, and through it, the light enters. Years passed, and the palace grew older with him. The walls bore the scent of oil and incense. The air was thick with the memory of psalms. David had rebuilt his kingdom from the ashes of shame, and yet he walked softly through his own halls, as though afraid to wake the past. He knew peace again, but it was the fragile kind, like glass that remembers the hammer. One morning, as the first light entered his chamber, he heard the sound of distant weeping. It was faint, carried through the corridors by servants too afraid to speak. The king rose, the weight of age upon his shoulders, and asked what sorrow haunted the dawn. A messenger bowed low and said, "Your son, Absalom, has grown proud. He gathers the hearts of men at the city gate and speaks against you." David closed his eyes. He had felt this storm building for years, the echo of his own rebellion rising in the blood of his child. Absalom was beautiful, brave, and brilliant, but his heart was restless, wounded by absence. David loved him deeply, yet distance had grown between them, like a wall of unspoken pain. He walked to the balcony and looked upon Jerusalem, the city he had once danced for. Its rooftops shimmered beneath the morning sun, but to him they looked heavy with foreboding. "It is the same sin," he whispered, "born again in another form, pride seeking to rise without patience, love turned inward into hunger." When Nathan came to him again, the prophet's face was grave. "The Lord has heard your psalms," he said. "Your heart has been cleansed, but your house must still reap what your hands once sowed. Your sons will strive against you, and peace will be brought with tears." David bowed his head, accepting what he could not change. "Then let my tears be my sacrifice," he said. In the days that followed, Absalom's rebellion spread like wildfire. The city that once crowned David now murmured betrayal. Men he had raised as brothers turned their faces away. And when the time came to flee, he did not fight. Barefoot, weeping, he crossed the Mount of Olives, the same hill where he had once sung to God in triumph. Now he sang again, but the melody was broken, his voice trembling like a reed in the wind. "Lord," he prayed, "if this cup is mine to drink, let it not turn my heart to stone. Let me love him still." The sun sank behind him, painting the sky in blood and amber. The road stretched long before him, the path of exile once more. Around him, his faithful few followed, silent as shadows. The years had stripped him of much, but not of humility. In the valley of betrayal, he had found it again. That night, as he camped beneath the open sky, he saw a light approaching, a lone torch weaving through the darkness. It was Zadok the priest, carrying the Ark of the Covenant upon his shoulders. "My king," he said, "we will go with you. Let the Ark dwell where you dwell." But David shook his head. "No," he said gently, "return it to the city. If I find favor again, God will bring me home. If not, let his will be done." He smiled faintly, the tears shining in his eyes. The presence does not follow men. It waits where mercy must be found. And so the ark was carried back to Jerusalem, while David lay upon the earth, face to the dust, whispering psalms no one else could hear. His kingdom was crumbling, but his soul, refined by every fall, was being rebuilt in ways unseen. He closed his eyes, and in the stillness between sorrow and surrender, he heard once more the ancient voice that had first called him from the fields. "You are still my beloved." The words fell upon him like rain on desert stone. And in that moment, even as his crown slipped away, David found again the only throne that mattered, the heart made humble before God. The wilderness had returned, though this time it wore the face of his own son. David walked among the scattered tents of his followers, his head bowed beneath the low sky. He felt older than the mountains, as if his bones had gathered the centuries themselves. The men whispered of defeat, but he told them, better to flee alive with truth than to win by hatred. They did not understand. Few ever do when a king chooses mercy over vengeance. Night came cold and trembling. The campfires burned small, and David sat apart, gazing into the dark. He remembered another valley, the one where Goliath had fallen. Then he had been the boy who faced giants. Now, the giant was in grief itself. Once he had held a sling, now he held nothing but love for the one who sought his life. How strange, he thought, that love can wound more deeply than any spear. The prophet Nathan came again in silence, carrying no rebuke this time, only sorrow. He sat beside David and said, "You are being asked again to trust the same voice that led you through youth and sin and sorrow. You must trust it now through loss." David nodded, too weary to answer. His heart was torn between father and king, justice and compassion. When morning rose, a messenger came, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dust. "Absalom has entered Jerusalem," he said. "He sits upon your throne." The words fell like stones, but David did not curse him. He only closed his eyes and whispered, "Then let him have it. Perhaps he will learn what I learned, that a crown is made of thorns." He walked a little apart, up a ridge where the wind carried the scent of wild sage. There he lifted his hands and prayed, "Lord, if you still dwell with me, then dwell also with him. If my sin has sown rebellion, let my mercy reap peace." The battle that followed came swift and brutal. David did not command it. He sent others in his place, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." He sat between two gates as the army went forth, his heart suspended between hope and dread. Hours passed. The sound of war drifted faintly through the hills, the clash of steel, the cry of men, the silence that followed both. At last, a runner appeared on the horizon. David rose to meet him, his breath caught in prayer. "Is it good with the young man Absalom?" he asked. The messenger faltered, eyes glistening. "May all your enemies be as that young man is." The words struck him harder than any spear. He turned away, his body folding as though pierced. He climbed the steps above the gate, covering his face with his hands, and wept the cry of a father, not a king. "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, would that I had died instead of you." The wail echoed through the camp, rolling across the valley like thunder made of sorrow. Men stopped where they stood, their victory forgotten, for they had never heard such love grieving even for its betrayer. David remained there until dusk, his tears falling upon the stones. When silence returned, he whispered, "So this is what it means to share your heart, O God, to love those who wound you, to weep for those who turn away." And in that understanding, the prophet's cry was fulfilled not in judgment, but in revelation. For David had come to see that the divine heart is not made of vengeance or pride, but of compassion deep enough to suffer for its children. The same God who forgave him now wept with him. As the night wind rose, it carried away the echoes of his grief, leaving only stillness, the stillness of a man who had finally learned the sacred cost of love. After Absalom's death, silence ruled the palace again. The people whispered that peace had returned, yet David felt only emptiness. The crown sat upon his head, but it was heavier than ever, not with jewels, but with grief. For what is victory, he thought, when bought by the death of love? He moved through the halls like a man walking through memories. Everywhere he turned, he saw the ghosts of his past, Saul's eyes in shadow, Bathsheba's tears, the laughter of a boy who once called him father. Even the walls seemed to remember. He could not escape himself. Every echo was his own voice returning through time. Joab, his commander, came to him, stern and weary. "You shamed the men who saved your life," he said. "Rise, my king, speak to them, or you will lose what remains." David looked at him, eyes hollow yet kind. "You speak the truth, Joab," he murmured, "but there are wars. The sword cannot end." Still, he went to the gate, and the soldiers bowed when they saw him. He blessed them with trembling lips and thanked them for their courage. Yet even as he spoke, his heart remained elsewhere with the son who lay beneath the soil. That night, he climbed the palace roof again. The city stretched before him, serene in moonlight. He thought of the shepherd he had once been, the boy who listened to wind instead of counsel. How far he had come, how far he had fallen. He whispered into the night, "Lord, teach me once more to hear you in the silence." The wind answered, soft but sure, "I never stopped speaking, David. You only stopped listening." He bowed his head and wept. When Nathan came again, older now, his hair white as ash, he found the king seated by the harp. The prophet's eyes were gentle, not with rebuke but remembrance. "You have walked through fire," Nathan said, "and though much has burned away, what remains is pure." David looked up slowly. "Then why do I still feel the ashes?" "Because they are holy," Nathan replied. "Every sorrow offered to God becomes sacred ground." The words pierced him deeper than any prophecy before. For the first time, David understood that repentance is not to erase the past, but to redeem it, to let even pain sing. That evening, he gathered his musicians and commanded that the psalms be written upon scrolls for the people. "Let them remember," he said, "that even a broken heart can become a temple." And so the songs that had begun in caves and tears were preserved for generations, melodies that rose from sin into grace, from exile into homecoming. One of his scribes asked him, "My lord, which psalm shall we place first?" David smiled faintly. "Begin where all journeys begin, with trust." And so the words were written, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The palace filled again with the sound of music, not the triumphant anthems of war, but hymns of peace, the kind that mend what power breaks. Even Joab paused to listen, his rough hands trembling, for in the king's voice he heard something larger than sorrow. He heard God breathing through a man who had finally laid down every weapon, even his own pride. David played until his fingers ached, until the walls that had once witnessed sin now vibrated with praise. Bathsheba watched from the doorway, her eyes soft with forgiveness. And when he finished, she said quietly, "You have turned pain into prayer." He smiled through tears. "No," he said, "God has." The moon hung high, silvering the harp strings, and the prophet's cry that truth must cut before it heals was complete. For in the man who once fell beneath his own desires, God had written a new song, not of conquest, but of compassion. And as David laid the harp beside him and closed his eyes, the wind carried the music beyond the palace, over the hills, through the valleys, whispering to every heart, still hiding in its own shadow. Even in your ruin, you are not forgotten. The years continued their quiet march, leaving silver in David's hair and wisdom in his gaze. The palace, once filled with battle cries and prophecies, now echoed with the laughter of children and the songs of old soldiers who had laid down their blades. Yet peace, for David, was never still. It trembled like a candle in the wind, forever touched by the breath of memory. He thought often of Solomon, the child of promise, the one whom God had marked with peace. The boy was bright, contemplative, gentle where David had been fierce. Sometimes David would watch him sleeping and whisper, "You will build what my hands could not. You will know the God who forgave me before you ever sinned." But not all his sons carried such stillness. The shadows that once ruled David's heart had not vanished. They had scattered among his lineage, taking new forms. The story of Absalom had already carved one wound. Now another rose from the depths of his household. It began with a whisper, an act of cruelty between kin, a sin that should have died in secrecy. Yet from that hidden fire, vengeance was born again. When David learned of the evil done among his children, brother against sister, his heart split anew. Rage and sorrow warred within him, but he hesitated, paralyzed by the weight of his own past. How could the man who had fallen speak judgment without trembling? And in his silence the wound deepened. Absalom, still burning from loss, took vengeance into his own hands. The blood that should have been cleansed by justice was spilled instead by wrath. And once again, David's love was tested, love for a son who avenged sin with sin. The court murmured that the king had grown soft, that he ruled with heart instead of iron. But David knew the truth. His kingdom had become a reflection of himself, radiant with grace, fractured by passion. He prayed by night, kneeling before the window that faced the hills of Bethlehem. "Lord," he whispered, "my sons carry the fire I once kindled. Let not their hands bear the weight of my shadow." The answer came not in thunder, but in remembrance. "The sword shall not depart from your house." And so it remained. Absalom, exiled again, wandered in bitterness. David longed for him, but pride built walls where words could not pass. When at last the young man returned to Jerusalem, their eyes met across the great hall, two mirrors reflecting the same ache. Absalom bowed low, yet his heart bowed not at all. In him, David saw his own defiance, beautiful, wounded, proud. That night, unable to sleep, the king took up his harp once more. He played softly, his fingers tracing melodies that were prayers more than songs. He did not play for triumph, nor for memory. He played to ask forgiveness for what still lived in his blood. The music drifted through the palace corridors and into the night air, until even the guards at their posts felt something soften inside them. It was a lullaby for the restless, a cry for all fathers who had loved imperfectly. When the song faded, David looked toward the stars and said, "I have given life, but not peace. Only you can give what I could not keep." The wind stirred the curtains, carrying the faint scent of cedar and myrrh. Somewhere in the city, Absalom slept, dreaming of thrones. And David, alone in the silence, felt again the sword that would not leave his house sharp, invisible, cutting through every generation until grace itself would bear its edge. He laid his harp aside and whispered, "Then let my line bear it. If only so the world will one day understand that mercy is stronger than blood." Time passed, but peace did not grow. It moved through David's house like smoke, seen for a moment, then gone. Absalom returned to the city, but reconciliation never truly came. Their words were polite, their embraces hollow. Between them stood the quiet shape of pride, patient and watchful. David tried to love him as before. He looked upon Absalom's beauty, his hair like sunlight, his smile like morning, and felt the ache of love mixed with dread. There was greatness in the boy, yes, but also hunger, the same hunger that once stirred in David when he reached too soon for what was not yet given. He saw it and said nothing, praying that silence might heal what judgment could not. But silence, once again, became the seed of rebellion. The people of Israel had grown restless. They loved their king, but they longed for new glory. Absalom stood among them like a promise, young, dazzling, full of the eloquence of fire. He spoke softly at the city gates, listening to grievances, offering kindness where law had grown slow. He stole not by sword, but by sympathy, and the hearts of the people turned toward him. When word reached David that his son had declared himself king in Hebron, he did not rage. He did not summon his armies or curse the heavens. He only bowed his head and said, "Let him have the city. Perhaps his hands can hold what mine have scarred." Then, barefoot and veiled in dust, he left Jerusalem again, the same road, the same exile, but now older, slower, gentler. As he walked, his people wept. Some begged him to fight. Others followed in silence. He stopped upon the Mount of Olives, the dawn breaking behind him, and looked once more upon the city of his love. "Lord," he prayed, "I know this hill. I once fled from Saul across it, young and full of songs. Now I flee from my son, empty and full of mercy. You have brought me full circle. Let your will be the only crown I keep." And the wind, that ancient companion, moved softly through the olive branches as if in answer. In the camp that night, David lay upon the ground beside his captains and loyal men. His sword lay near, but he did not touch it. Instead, he held his harp, the strings faint beneath his fingertips. He hummed a psalm, one born of fatigue and faith. "I lift my eyes to the hills from whence comes my help. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth." The men, hearing his voice, slept without fear. They knew that wherever David's song was sung, God was near. At dawn, scouts returned with word that Absalom's forces were approaching, vast, proud, burning with the certainty of youth. Joab stood ready, spear in hand, his eyes like steel. He turned to the king and said, "Command us." David nodded, but whispered, "Deal gently with the young man, for my sake." Joab frowned, but said nothing. As they prepared for battle, David's hands trembled. He remembered holding Absalom as a child, the laughter that once filled the palace corridors, the promise in his eyes. Now that laughter had turned to echoes of war. When the trumpets sounded, David did not watch the fight. He sat between the gates of Mahanaim, his head bowed, praying not for victory, but for mercy. He prayed that somehow love would find a way through the ruin, that the sword which haunted his house would finally rest. But love, in that moment, could not stop what was written. For Absalom, beautiful, reckless Absalom, would soon learn that the tree bends even for princes. The day of battle came heavy with heat. The forest of Ephraim trembled beneath the feet of thousands, the cries of men echoing through its green heart like thunder that could not end. Dust rose into light, and the air tasted of iron. David waited in Mahanaim, his soul torn between prayer and dread. He could not lift his sword, for he had given that burden to time. He could only wait and listen, for the sound of loss always arrives before the messenger does. The forest itself seemed to choose sides. Branches broke, roots tangled, horses stumbled. Absalom rode proud upon his mule, his hair that glorious crown of youth streaming like flame behind him. He looked not backward, only ahead, as though destiny were something to be chased, not received. But destiny, like mercy, catches us when we least expect it. As he passed beneath a great oak, his hair caught in the branches, pulling him violently from his mount. The mule ran on, and Absalom hung between heaven and earth, suspended, helpless, struggling against the very beauty that had made him beloved. It was a terrible grace. The son of the king hung between sky and soil, caught by what had once crowned him. When Joab found him there, he remembered David's command, "Deal gently with the young man." But Joab's heart was made of war, not mercy. He saw rebellion, not a son. And so, with 3 javelins, he pierced the boy's heart. The forest fell silent, as if creation itself held its breath. The battle ended swiftly after that. Absalom's army scattered, and victory returned to David. But the crown of triumph turned to dust in his hands when the messenger came running. "My lord, the battle has gone in your favor," he said, panting, dust on his lips. David's eyes searched his face like a storm. "And the young man, Absalom, is he safe?" The messenger faltered. His silence was enough. David rose slowly, every movement a wound. He walked to the chamber above the gate, the soldiers parting in reverent quiet. And when the truth reached him fully, his cry broke through the walls, through the city, through time itself. "O my son, Absalom, my son, my son! Would God I have died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son!" The words echoed like a psalm of sorrow, shaking the stones. Those who heard it wept, for in that cry was all the pain of a father's heart and something more. It was the sound of divine grief, of the eternal weeping through mortal lips. The same love that mourns every lost soul, every exile, every child who turns away. David fell to the ground and pressed his face into the dust, whispering through his tears, "Lord, now I know. This is how you love us. This is how you suffer when we stray." All his life he had sung of God's mercy. Now he felt it not as comfort, but as an ache, a love so deep it breaks itself to remain faithful. Night came, heavy and blue. The torches outside flickered like dying stars, and David sat alone beside the window, his hand trembling over the harp. He did not play. He simply rested his fingers upon the strings until they hummed faintly beneath his touch, like a heartbeat. He whispered, "Let the sword rest now, Lord. Let my house learn peace." And the strings gave one last sigh, soft as forgiveness. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the river carried away the sounds of mourning. And though David did not know it, that cry, "O my son," would one day echo again upon another hill through another father who would weep for his children. For love, once born, never stops echoing. It learns to live even in the sound of loss. The kingdom was quiet again. The years had softened the sound of battle, though peace never sat easily upon David's shoulders. He had buried too many sons, forgiven too many enemies, and walked too long beneath the shadow of his own mercy. His hair was white now, his hands thin, but his eyes still carried the strange fire of one who had seen both heaven's light and its silence. Jerusalem lay beneath him like a jewel in dust. Its rooftops shimmered in the evening sun, the people's songs drifting faintly from the streets below. From the terrace, David could see the hills of his youth, Bethlehem, in the distance, small as memory. He often wondered how many stars had watched over him since those shepherd days. Perhaps, he thought, the same ones still burned, ancient and patient, waiting for him to remember what they had always whispered, "All that is counted belongs to God." But that evening, as twilight fell, a strange thought stirred within him, a restlessness that would become his final test. He called for Joab, his old commander, and said, "Go now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know their strength." Joab hesitated, his weathered face troubled. "Why, my king? Has the Lord not given us peace? What need do we have to count what belongs to him?" But David's heart had grown proud in subtle ways. He no longer sought to measure mercy, he sought to measure might. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, the reach of his reign, the proof of his success. Joab obeyed, reluctantly. For months he traveled through the land, counting men fit for war, marking each number upon parchment. And with every tally, heaven grew quieter. When the report was brought back, David looked upon the scroll and felt an emptiness he could not name. The numbers were high, the kingdom strong, yet his heart trembled. He realized too late that he had done what he once swore never to do. He had trusted in what could be seen, not in the unseen hand that had always guided him. That night, he fell to his knees, the parchment still clutched in his hand. "I have sinned greatly in what I have done," he whispered. "Take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have acted foolishly." Before dawn, the prophet Gad came to him, a messenger of both mercy and consequence. "Thus says the Lord," Gad spoke softly. "You must choose your correction. 7 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing before your enemies, or 3 days of pestilence upon the land." David bowed his head. "I am in great distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercies are great. But let me not fall into the hands of man." And so the plague came silent, swift, unseen. It moved through the cities like wind through wheat, leaving stillness in its wake. From morning to evening, thousands fell. The cries of the dying reached even to the palace, and David could bear it no more. He tore his robes, fell upon the earth, and cried out, "Behold, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand be against me, and against my house." As he prayed, the angel of the Lord appeared, a flame standing between heaven and Jerusalem, its sword drawn over the city. David saw it and trembled, but the angel's arm stopped midair, for mercy had spoken. The Lord said, "It is enough." And there, upon the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the king who had numbered his people fell upon his face. He bought that ground with silver and built an altar, offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, saying, "Hear, O Lord, let the plague cease." And it did. Smoke rose into the sky, curling like forgiveness. The same wind that once carried his songs now carried the scent of atonement. And as the first stars pierced the veil of dusk, David looked upward and whispered, "They are too many to count. Yours, all yours." He had learned at last what the stars had always known, that what belongs to God cannot be measured, only marveled at. The fire upon the altar burned through the night, a low flame that whispered of both grief and grace. David sat beside it, his face lit in shifting gold. He had no crown upon his head, no harp in his hands, only the ache of understanding. The wind that swept through the threshing floor carried the smell of rain, and for the first time in many years he felt the gentle nearness of God, not in triumph, but in surrender. Araunah, the farmer who had sold him the land, approached quietly and bowed. "My king, you owe me nothing. Take the oxen for sacrifice, take the wood, take the floor. Let it be my gift to the Lord." David looked up, his eyes weary but kind. "No," he said softly, "I will not offer to God that which costs me nothing." He lifted his hands toward the fire, its heat trembling against his palms. The words came unbidden, half prayer, half song. "All I have numbered, I now return. All I have claimed, I now release. For what is man but dust that breathes, and what is mercy but breath returned?" The flame flared briefly, then settled. In its glow, the angel was gone, and the sky above Jerusalem cleared. The stars shone brighter than he had ever seen them, countless, immeasurable, alive. David sat there until dawn, watching the horizon blush with light. He thought of the boy he once was, lying in the fields of Bethlehem, counting constellations with fingers still too small to hold a crown. He realized then that he had spent his life learning to lose what he could not keep, and in losing, to discover what was never his to claim. When he returned to the palace, he carried with him no scrolls, no reports, no pride. He called for his scribes and commanded that the census be struck from the record. "Let it be forgotten," he said. "The only number that matters is mercy, and it is without end." The years that followed were gentle but quiet. He ruled not with conquest, but with memory. Each judgment he made was tempered with humility. Each victory was given back in gratitude. He had learned that the true weight of kingship is not in commanding men, but in standing before God with nothing hidden. One night, Solomon came to him, now grown and wise beyond his years. "Father," he asked, "why did you buy that threshing floor when you already owned a kingdom?" David smiled faintly and replied, because I needed a place to meet God that was not mine." He placed his hand upon Solomon's shoulder. "You will build the house I never could. Build it there upon the ground where pride was undone." Solomon nodded, and for a moment David saw in his son's eyes the peace he had spent his life seeking. He whispered, "The Lord has chosen you to build his dwelling. But remember, the temple is not for him alone. It is for every heart that must be rebuilt." Later, when the palace slept, David climbed once more to the roof. He looked upon Jerusalem bathed in silver light, the city breathing softly beneath the stars. Each spark above seemed to pulse with memory: the giant's fall, the shepherd's psalm, the prophet's cry, the child's death, the mercy that followed. All of it woven together like constellations forming one great truth, that every life, no matter how fractured, can still shine when held in the hand of God. He closed his eyes and breathed the cool night air. "Count them, if you will, Lord," he murmured, smiling. "I cannot. I can only worship." And somewhere in that silence, beyond the stars and the years, heaven answered not in thunder or wind, but in peace. The same peace that had once lingered over Bethlehem's hills, now resting upon the heart of an old king who had finally learned to stop counting and simply believe. Morning light poured through the lattice of the palace window, soft and gold as honey. David sat upon his couch, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his harp. It had been many months since the plague, yet the echo of it remained a silence that had changed the rhythm of his breath. He had once thought repentance was a single moment, a tear shed and forgotten. Now he knew it was a lifelong conversation between the soul and its maker. The air smelled of cedar and oil. Beyond the walls, the sound of builders rose from the city hammers striking stone, voices calling across scaffolds. The temple was beginning, not under his hand, but his son's. Solomon's workers were gathering timber from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, and wisdom from the legacy of his father's failures. David smiled faintly at the sound. The boy was patient, measured so unlike him. He will build not only walls, the king thought, but peace. Yet even as pride warmed him, he felt the gentle whisper of humility remind him, "It is I who build through you both." He closed his eyes and spoke softly to the silence. "Lord, I have learned to count not stones, but mercies. I have learned that your glory does not dwell in number, but in nearness." The years had taught him to see heaven not in grandeur, but in grace, in the breath of forgiveness, in the trembling light upon his harp strings, in the way love endures long after power fades. Nathan visited him once more, his beard now silver, his hands trembling with age. They sat together upon the terrace, watching the city glow beneath the setting Sunday. "You have seen much, my king," the prophet said. "Kings rise and fall, sons rebel and return. Tell me, after all this, what remains?" David looked at the horizon, where the first star appeared. "Only this," he said, "that mercy is stronger than judgment and love stronger than death. I have chased God through triumph and failure and always found him waiting." Nathan smiled. "Then your psalms will live longer than your crown." That night, David took his harp for the last time. His fingers, though frail, still found their home upon the strings. The melody that rose was slow and tender, a sound that belonged not to earth, but to eternity. It was not a song of kings, nor of sorrow, but of surrender. He sang of the stars that could not be counted, of the God who knew each one by name. He sang of the boy who listened to wind and became a man who learned to listen to silence. He sang of forgiveness of a heart that had broken 1,000 times and still found its way back to love. When the final note faded, the palace seemed to breathe with him. The servants who passed by paused, sensing something holy in the air. Bathsheba stood quietly in the doorway, tears glinting like small stars in her eyes. Solomon knelt beside his father, listening, though no words were spoken. David turned to him and whispered, "Remember, my son, a king's strength is measured, not in the swords he commands, but in the tears he does not hide. Build the temple not to contain God, but to remind men he cannot be contained. Then, laying his hand upon Solomon's head, he blessed him. And as the night deepened, David looked once more toward the heavens. The stars shimmered endless above him, vast, innumerable, alive. He smiled through the breath that would be his last, and said, "I once tried to count them, now I simply join them." And the shepherd who became a king, who fell and rose and sang his way through exile and glory, closed his eyes upon earth and opened them upon the face of the one whose heart he had always sought. The harp fell silent, the flame upon the altar burned steady, and the stars kept singing, for David, the man after God's own heart, had come home. Jerusalem awoke to quiet. The dawn rose soft and rose-colored over the hills, the city veiled in mist like a dream remembering itself. Inside the palace, the servants moved with reverence, speaking in whispers, for the king had gone to rest. The room where David had breathed his last still held the faint scent of oil and cedar, of prayer and tears mingled together. Solomon stood at the doorway, the light touching his face. In his father's stillness, he felt both ending and beginning the silence after a song, the echo that refuses to fade. He looked at the harp lying beside the bed, one string broken, the rest humming faintly with the memory of touch. He dared not play it yet. He only bowed his head and said, "Sleep well, shepherd of Israel. Your song is not finished." Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain from the desert, and the olive trees whispered as though retelling old stories. The people gathered in the streets, mourning not with wails, but with soft hymns. For how does one grieve a man whose life had already become prayer? David's psalms were sung in every corner, from temple courtyards to the hearths of shepherds, from the lips of priests to the whispers of widows. His words, once born in solitude, now belonged to the world, and each voice that sang them was like a candle lit from his flame. Far above, the sky deepened from gold to blue, and the stars, though unseen in the light, still lingered as they had through every chapter of his life. They had watched the shepherd's vigil, the warrior's courage, the sinner's tears, the father's grief, the king's humility. Now they watched the peace that follows a soul's last surrender. Solomon ordered that his father be buried in the city of David, beneath the hill where psalms had first been sung. As the procession moved, the people wept, yet their sorrow carried beauty, for their tears were mingled with gratitude. They knew their king had left more than victories. He had left language for the heart's cry, a way for the lost to find their voice before God. When night fell, Solomon stood upon the same rooftop where his father had once prayed and stumbled, sung and wept. The stars shimmered above him like eyes unblinking, ancient and kind. He lifted the harp, repaired and tuned anew, and touched its strings. The sound rose, pure, trembling, alive. It filled the air like breath returning to a sleeping world. And in that music, Solomon felt his father's presence not in form, but in memory, in mercy, in the quiet rhythm of love that endures. He realized that the Song of David had never been about a single man or a single life. It was the song of all who fall and rise again, of all who wander far and are still found. As the melody drifted over Jerusalem, a dove passed across the moon, its wings cutting a silver path through the sky. The people below paused and looked upward, their faces lifted to the sound. Some said they heard words in it, others only light, but all felt peace. Solomon lowered the harp and whispered, "The song continues," and the wind seemed to answer, carrying the last echo of David's voice through the streets, over the Temple Mount, out into the desert where the stars once watched a shepherd boy listen to God. Even now, when the faithful lift their eyes and sing the psalms, it is said the earth grows still to listen, for somewhere, beneath eternity's veil, David still sings, not of kings or crowns or battles won, but of the mercy that outlasts every fall, the love that never leaves, the God who still walks beside the broken. Years passed, yet the song did not die. Long after David was laid to rest, his voice continued to move through the hearts of men like a river through stone. His psalms became the breath of a nation, sung at dawn by shepherds, whispered at twilight by widows, chanted by priests as incense curled toward the heavens. Every generation found its reflection in his words, for they carried both the ache of being human and the peace of being loved. In the temple Solomon built, the great bronze doors opened to the sound of David's melodies. The choirs sang beneath vaulted ceilings of gold, their voices lifting the ancient words. "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" Each note shimmered like dust in sunlight, rising upward until it seemed to merge with eternity itself. And yet, even in heaven's quiet halls, the song lived on. For what is a prayer but the soul's echo returning to its source? When angels spoke of devotion, they spoke of the shepherd who sang through tears, who praised even from the pit, who turned his failure into offering. They called him the psalmist of broken hearts, for through his wounds God had taught the world how to heal. Sometimes, when night covers the earth and silence deepens, it is said that David's harp still trembles somewhere beyond the veil, its strings touched by unseen hands, its notes falling like soft rain upon the weary. Those who listen closely can feel it not in the ears, but in the chest, that small, steady rhythm that whispers, "You are not alone." And in that knowing, the story completes itself. For David's life was never meant to be a tale of perfection. It was the story of a soul that kept returning from sin to grace, from fear to faith, from crown to dust and back again. He showed that holiness is not the absence of failure, but the refusal to stop reaching for God in the midst of it. The stars that had once watched his youth still shine above us, ancient and patient, singing the same unending refrain. That mercy endures, that love remains, that even when we forget the melody, heaven remembers the song. And so, the shepherd's music became eternal. It is heard whenever a heart breaks open in prayer, whenever a sinner whispers hope through tears, whenever silence feels heavy, and someone still dares to say, "The Lord is my shepherd." In the end, that is the legacy of David, not the throne, not the battles, not the glory of Jerusalem, but the sound of a soul returning home again and again to the God who never stopped waiting. The night deepens, and the stars begin their ancient dance. Their light falls softly upon the hills of Bethlehem, where another shepherd once stood watch, hearing angels sing a familiar tune. And through the ages, through the silence and the song, one truth remains, that every life, every rise, every fall is but a verse in the great psalm of love. And when the final note is played, and all hearts are still, the voice of the Eternal will whisper what David always knew. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow you all the days of your life, and you shall dwell in my house forever." Rest now, beloved soul. The story has been told. The harp has fallen silent, yet its echo lingers in your breath. You have walked beside kings and shepherds, through valleys of sorrow and hills of mercy. You have seen what the stars have always known, that light is never lost, only hidden for a time. Let the quiet take you now. Feel the weight of the world lift from your shoulders, as David's crown once did when he knelt in the dust. There is nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove. Only this, the stillness that holds the whisper of God. You are safe here. You are remembered. You are, even now, being sung over by the same presence that watched the boy in the fields, the king in his sorrow, the old man in his peace. The same love that wrote his psalms is writing yours gently, endlessly, in the secret language of the soul. Breathe slowly. Each breath is an answer to prayer. Each heartbeat is a reminder that the Eternal still walks beside you, unseen but nearer than your pulse. And as you drift into sleep, know this. Every night is another verse in the same divine song, a song of falling and rising, of forgetting and remembering, of dust turned again to light. The shepherd rests, the harp sleeps, but the melody remains. May it cradle you as you dream, a soft echo in your chest, a promise on your lips. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.